extended or metaphorical way as meaning something like becoming mortal. Then it could be that Adam and Eve were originally immortal and became subject to death by eating the fruit. This interpretation would allow us to acquit God of the charge of lying, but it's not particularly well supported by the text. We are never told that God planned for Adam to live forever, and the rich early imagery of mortality, dust of the earth. These passages strongly suggest that Adam was doomed to die all along. Furthermore, it's not as if the trees being dangerous would vindicate God's parenting style. This supposition would make the warning reasonable, but it would also raise a serious question. If the tree has the power to kill, why did God create it in the first place? The mother in Hecate Peg did not introduce danger into her children's environment, but God controls everything. Why would he deliberately place within easy reach of his inexperienced children an appealing object that poses a mortal danger? A human parent would be judged criminally negligent for such behavior, and even unrelated adults can be held liable if a child suffers injuries in connection with a, quote, attractive nuisance, unquote, on their property. And speaking of hazards in the garden, whether or not the tree is dangerous, there is, according to conventional interpretations, at least one other thing in the garden that is. The serpent, tradition says, is evil, perhaps literally diabolical, and is bent on destroying Adam and Eve's relationship with their loving father. Yet God never mentions this creature to Adam, never warns him that there's a liar afoot who'll try to trick him into disobedience. Why not? The mother in Hecate Peg realizes that there are evil people around, eager to take advantage of naive and open-hearted children. Why doesn't God at least warn Adam not to speak to strangers? Of course, one could interpret God's words differently, not as a warning about a dangerous object, but as a threat. Eat that fruit and I'll kill you. I don't think this is right, but not because such a monstrous proclamation would be out of character. Elsewhere, God shows himself quite willing to punish a single act of disobedience with the ultimate sanction. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm not going to go through these examples. I suspect that these are all extremely familiar to everyone in this audience, so I'll just put them up there as a kind of indication of the counts in my indictment. The only thing that would be unusual about God's threatening Adam with death would be the advance notice. None of these people knew that the things that they did were going to carry the penalty that they endured. My reason for rejecting the threat interpretation, rather, is that it doesn't fit the rest of the text. If God had been threatening Adam with death, why didn't he kill Adam as soon as the forbidden fruit was eaten? God does punish Adam and Eve for their transgression, but the penalties are far less harsh than death. And as we know from the examples above, God is not soft-hearted. As a parent, God is not looking good. If the commandment is a warning, he's a liar. If it's a threat, he's a bully. But warning or threat, we still don't know the purpose of the prohibition. If it's not to keep Adam safe, what's it for? An answer given by many interpreters, at least ones that I interacted with when I was a child, an answer given by many interpreters is that God issues the prohibition in order to test Adam, to see if he's obedient. There's a great deal to say about this suggestion. One might think that the hypothesis that God is testing Adam at least answers the question why God put a dangerous tree in the garden. But while it might explain the presence of the tree, it cannot adequately explain its lethality. If God merely needed a prop for a learning exercise, he could have used a benign species. Stay away from the mulberry bush. But if the tree is really dangerous, we must once again question God's motives as a parent. I cannot see how there could be any legitimate parental purpose that such a test might serve that would not be undercut by the peril of the test itself. Consider this case. A parent, worried about adulterated Halloween candy, makes a rule that her child cannot eat anything until he has brought it home for inspection. The parent is worried, however, that the child will be too tempted by the goodies in the bag to obey the rule. She doesn't want to deprive the child of the fun of trick-or-treating if she doesn't have to, so she decides to do a little experiment to see if the child can be trusted. She employs a confederate, someone the child doesn't know, to offer him some candy, and then she observes what happens. Now, perhaps such an experiment would be reasonable, but only if the test candy isn't poisoned. The testing hypothesis might also seem to explain at once both the presence of the serpent and God's failure to warn Adam about him. The idea would be that God intended for Adam or Eve to encounter the tempter. The snake is part of the plan. But this rationale runs into the same problem I described above. If the serpent is really evil, and if there is a substantial risk that Adam and Eve will succumb, then there's no difference between the test and the danger that's supposed to make the test necessary. The parent in my example does not enlist a child murderer as her confederate. Suppose then that the tree and the serpent are both benign. Would the test be legitimate in that case? Given that God clearly intends to punish his children if they fail the test, I think not. If God somehow engineered the encounter between Eve and the serpent, he was engaging in entrapment. The reason that entrapment is wrong when human police do it is that it increases the likelihood of there being a crime. If laws are just, then violations of laws are ipso facto bad. The point of stings is to arrest people who anyway are engaged in criminal activity and not to generate criminal activity that would not otherwise have occurred. We human beings all have our breaking points, and it is unjust for people in authority to push until they find them. Another point, God, should he choose to engage in this kind of entrapment, has significantly more resources at his disposal than do mere human beings. While human beings must rely on fallible empirical knowledge about what people are likely to do in the circumstances they have arranged, God can control minds. The Odysseys to the contrary notwithstanding, the God of the Hebrew Bible has no scruples against directly manipulating his creatures' free will, even if the actions that his puppet subsequently performs carry formidable punishments. Pharaoh, recall, tried repeatedly to free the Israelites and even to repent of his own misdeeds, but God kept hardening his heart. God did this to occasion the administration of ever more monstrous plagues, also that, quote, the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. It's particularly chilling to think of a parent entrapping a child. Part of the responsibility of a parent is to shield her child from temptation until the child develops the resources to resist it. Good human parents make rules that conduce to their children's well-being, and so are distressed when their rules are broken. They do not test the limits of their children's forbearance, nor contrive opportunities to punish their children. The difference between God's attitude toward his disobedient children and the mother's towards hers demonstrates the perversity of God's priorities. The mother in Hecate understands that her children are children. She realizes that they may not appreciate how dangerous it could be to disobey her. As it happens, the petitioner who approaches them seems completely harmless and offers an inducement their mother's instructions did not anticipate. The children are taken in and disaster ensues. When the mother discovers their disobedience and its consequences, her first and indeed her only thought is for her children. How can she get them back? Not until the children are rescued does she begin to think about blame or punishment, and then her ire falls not on the disobedient children, but on Hecate, the powerful adult who is the actual agent of the crisis. She, not the children, has committed a crime, and she, fittingly, is the one who must be banished from village society. God, however, takes no account of his children's position and limitations. Adam and Eve, though physically mature, are psychological and intellectual infants. They have no knowledge of the world and no experience to tell them who to trust. They lack, quote, knowledge of good and evil, end quote, and so presumably can have no sense of duty to God, even if in fact they are morally bound to obey him, which I doubt. The serpent who approaches Eve either at God's behest or at his sufferance disputes God's claims that she and Adam would be harmed by eating the fruit. He gives her a strong positive reason to want to eat the fruit, a reason that also makes sense of God's attempt to keep it off limits. How is Eve supposed to know who is lying? When God discovers that his children have disobeyed him, the first punishment meted out is to the serpent, but God deals mercilessly with Adam and Eve. He doesn't kill them as perhaps he'd threatened to do, but he does impose heavy sentences. According to traditional interpretations, the punishments are so potent that their effects persist through generations, afflicting every one of the pair's descendants. To prevent further disruption within God's domain, the children are thrown out of their home. This last act is simply the culmination of what has been one long episode of neglect and abuse, and God's treatment of Adam and Eve is just the beginning. The Hebrew Bible records on nearly every page divine behavior that meets the legal definition of child maltreatment. There it is.